Hi, my name's Chris Fleming, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
If you could just tell the listener a little bit about yourself, please, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
Well, I'm currently an associate professor of philosophy at Western Sydney University. I grew up in Sydney, Australia. It's where I still live. And, I still write Catholic on the census, although maybe I'm just a misanthrope because every time I'm around Catholics, I feel very secular. But when I'm around secular people, I feel very Catholic. So maybe it just means I'm a kind of one of those automatic gainsayers or light rebels who are basically perverse, really. And how I've come to believe what I believe, I guess, is a combination of personal history, cultural history, and philosophical or intellectual investigation. So somewhere in there.
Yeah, before we get too deep into the philosophy, and I do want to get into that, what were your first sort of ideas about God and religion, and how did that affect you, and how did that change as you turned into adulthood? If you could just sort of paint a broad picture of that, that would be good.
Sure. Look, I grew up as the youngest of seven in a big family, and we went to Mass in a very standard way every week. It didn't matter where in the world we were. It was just as important to secure a church attendance as it was to get accommodation. I can only remember it beat us once, combination of time zone changes and something else. And there was a lot of prayer and talk of God in the house, although it was Catholic, there were regular criticisms or admonishments of Rome. There was an openness, especially in my father, to look at other scriptures and so on. So you have a very orthodox Catholicism combined with something that you might call a kind of post-Vatican II radicalism. And my dad's still alive. He's 93, goes to Mass every day. But this is a guy that also knows the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and is a meditator and so on. So that's the kind of environment I grew up in. Thinking about God and thinking about religion were as natural as breathing to me from a very early age. There was no sense in which I had any question about any of that until much, much later, and really talking in my early 20s. And so it seemed a very normal and a very natural part of life to me.
I remember, just to give you an example, when I was a child in Sunday school, I was very moved by John the Baptist, the story of John the Baptist. So there might be little events like that that sort of pop out in that timeline. Could you talk briefly about that event?
That's really interesting, actually. I've never thought of it before. But in year 4, I remember hearing the story properly of the crucifixion for the first time and was just devastated by it. And that sounds like a negative experience. It wasn't a negative experience in some ways, although there was a lot of tears. And from my recollection, there were a lot of tears in the classroom generally. It was an extraordinarily powerful experience, I guess, and that was really a very powerful moment for me.
You would have been 8 or 9 years old?
Yeah, about 9. I guess powerful at the time. I met Mother Teresa. She was at a local Brigidine nun convent in Randwick, and I met her then, and I've only got dim recollections of it. I guess one of the most powerful other influences, and again, I'm only really thinking about this for the first time, was in year 12 when I had a principal come into our classroom and he was taking the religious education. And rather than coming in and giving us a whole series of dogmatic things to believe, he started challenging us. He said, "How do we know this is true anyway?" Obviously, this is a guy that lives in a religious community, and it was a very powerful form of an introduction to thinking about the faith in a critical way, with him knowing full well that when we left school, we'd be getting these challenges. And so him coming in and playing skeptic was an incredibly powerful experience in a way, precisely because it seemed to imply that there was some intellectual foundation here and that we were comfortable in our faith, and he shook us up a bit, and that was a really meaningful experience too, I think.
It brings to mind St. Thomas Aquinas with his Summa and the challenges that he opposed to his own way of thinking. So I think it would be appropriate now to sort of fill in the gaps in the sort of philosophical journey. Can you talk us through that a little bit, the highlights?
Yeah, look, I became best friends, I guess, with a really rabid atheist, and we would spend hours and hours in discussion. And I think at the end of a number of years of very intense debate and discussion, I think I really shook up his atheism, and he really shook up my belief. Right? We destabilized each other, and so there was this moment at which an intellectual approach to religion started to overtake what had been the ritual approach to it, even to the extent of a very strange series of habits. One was driving to church, but sitting outside it and reading philosophy. Kind of bizarre thing to do in a way. But there was this intense challenging of my faith and coming up face to face, I guess, with a kind of nihilism and thinking maybe none of this is true. Maybe, I've been enculturated to think these things. Maybe it's all rubbish. And that was an incredibly challenging and disturbing thing. And I don't think it's specific to religious people. My friend who's an atheist, he was really disturbed by having his atheism shaken. The other thing, I guess, is I had a major relationship breakdown at that age too. And in some ways, the crisis of the relationship fed into this crisis of faith. I think it's very difficult to separate these things out. At the time, I thought it was a purely intellectual thing. Now I don't think there is such a thing as pure intellect, really. There was a real shaking up of my world because of the end of a romantic relationship. A girlfriend I'd been going out with for a few years, combined with these other more existential questions. I guess they're all existential questions, right? But that was really a pretty turbulent time for me, in a time where I started to take all sorts of crazy personal risks. I drank a lot. I got into drugs, and all kinds of insane behavior took hold.
So you plunged into the dark side a little bit and into sin?
Well, if there's no God, there's no sin, right? Like, I didn't think of it as sin at the time. And also, I'd always had a conception of sin as something that offends the other. This seemed to be a form of self-destruction. And yeah, it got really bad. There was a kind of absolute disregard for myself. Somehow I managed to hold my studies together through all of this. I've got no idea how. Very deep depression through a lot of it, and a lot of behaviour that's really, as a good middle class kid, I never held up banks, right? I never assaulted anyone. But there was this incredible and very deep sadness and real forms of self-abasement and self-destruction that continued, which in my family had been going on for generations: religious or irreligious, drug addiction, alcoholism, depression, which I only found out about much later. But I sunk very deeply into that. It wasn't all darkness, right? There were moments and maybe days, maybe weeks of joy. But there was a good 10 years there where things were, at the very least, very volatile.
I didn't fall into nihilism. I went the other way, the polar opposite, the extreme end of the spectrum, which is solipsism. At the end of my atheism, I was atheist for 25 years, and near the end, I was a solipsist. So I thought that I was the only one that existed. It is a brighter and a happier place to be than nihilism, but it's not much better, really, because it really is lonely thinking that everything is an illusion.
And you really believed that? You really thought there was nothing outside your own mental creation?
Yeah. This led me actually into atheistic Satanism. That is basically, there is no God, there is no devil, but you are God, do your will. It's not nihilistic, but it's very narcissistic, obviously. But I do feel lucky that I didn't go into nihilism, because in nihilism you don't even have yourself, do you, really?
Not really. Everything is up for grabs all the time, and there are no values to which you can pledge your allegiance which seem to give you any mooring. There is nothing. I've never met a nihilist who doesn't, at some level, live antithetically to that philosophical scheme. It's like a moral relativist. I mean, someone just has to tell you about their moral relativism, and then if you take their car, they'll get very upset. They're not really relativists all the way down. Or, the people that believe the world is an illusion. ask them to get their checkbook out and to write you a check. And you'll very quickly find they're maybe not as committed to that belief as what they thought they were. And in some way, the opening to a more religious view was the understanding that I didn't really believe nihilism, not at its deepest level. I couldn't convince myself that things like love and my attachment to people were simply fabrications. It's not something I could even will myself to believe in any serious way. And in some sense, it was an intuition that maybe value itself is woven into the very fabric of the universe, that love is a force in the universe and is imbricated in reality in a way that anything else is, And once you take that idea seriously, things look a bit different.
Do you remember having conversion experiences that centered on your worldview and on your philosophy and on your reading?
I remember having a debate with my dad and challenging him on a number of points of faith. And what he said to me is, he said, you're more than welcome to reject this, but I think you're obliged to understand it first. The problem, I think, for many Christians growing up is they think they know what they're talking about. It sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but if you're born into something rather than coming from the outside, there's this assumption that you know what you're talking about. If you say Christ died for our sins, or you say I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but I don't think I had any real sense of what those phrases even meant, despite saying them thousands of times. And so that was an interesting moment at which I realised this sense of which I've got no idea what I'm talking about. I don't know whether I now know what I'm talking about, but there was a kind of shattering of a certain kind of arrogance at that point. And I guess the last point for me, a really important point, and again, I guess it was an intellectual conversion, was reading the work of the French-American literary theorist, anthropologist Rene Girard. And he has these discussions of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and it just blew my head off, because I had no idea that you could make sense of these things in a way that was really coherent and wasn't just about a cosmology of this happened, then this happened, or a history. It was about how humans operate, how we behave, how we form communities and destroy them. And I was just so stunned that any of this stuff even made sense. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Girard says is that, it's a very provocative point. He says that Nietzsche, this 19th century German philosopher, understood Christianity better than 19th century theologians. And what he meant by that was, in the 18th and 19th century, as Western intellectuals travelled the globe and they started to see other religious forms, a lot of the myths looked a lot like Christian stories. So you had these warring brothers, right? So Romulus and Remus, or you also have dying and rising gods, and so on and so forth. Now, the insistence of a lot of theologians at that point was like, yeah, we can see that, but Christianity is actually the true one. What Nietzsche ended up saying is, no, they're not the same. If you think the Christian story is the same as these other stories, you don't even understand the genre. And Girard says he was right. He's an atheist, but he saw this difference. And one of the key differences is that the stories in the Bible are narrated from the point of view of the victims of the violence. So if you look at, say, something like Romulus and Remus, these brothers, they get into this rivalry, and Romulus kills Remus, and it's seen as necessary and good, and the human community is founded, but it's seen as a good and just thing. Now, of course, in Cain and Abel, the same thing happens. You have the foundation of the first human community, but the editorial perspective is entirely different. Your brother's blood cries out to you from the ground. Now, if you miss that, you've missed the whole thing. And Girard says again and again and again in the Bible, what you have is this deconstruction of violence. And the same things are narrated for the purpose of pulling the mythology apart. So the Bible, in a sense, is an anti-mythology. It's something that looks at the way humans obscure their own violence from themselves. There's so many examples of this. Joseph and his brothers and the Psalms, and leading right up to the crucifixion. I mean, the death and resurrection of Dionysus is very different from the death and resurrection of Jesus, simply because Dionysus comes back and wreaks revenge, and and so that was a profound insight. And Nietzsche saw it first, oddly enough. Because Nietzsche wanted to preserve the old myths. He liked the old violence. And he says, if you think Jesus is anything like Dionysus, you're deluded. He was in favour of Dionysus, not Christ. He thought Christianity ruined everything.
Can you talk just a little bit about the slave morality, master morality, if you know what that's about?
It's a complicated issue, but Nietzsche ended up saying, he has a book called The Genealogy of Morality, and what he says is that what you have in Judaism and Christianity is basically the narration of a defeated people, and that what the Christians and Jews do is turn virtues out of weaknesses. So if you're defeated, you become slaves, then you turn being a slave into a virtue, and so on. And so what he thought was that Christianity and Judaism were essentially the results of ressentiment. They were the results of resentment towards powerful people. So you can't beat someone, you can't get on top of them militarily. So you go, all right, well, I can't get on top of them. I will make meekness my chief value, and that way I'll beat them. Now, the fact is Nietzsche got the story the wrong way round. It's not so much that Christianity is the result of ressentiment. Ressentiment is a product of Christianity. What I mean by that is that if you have a religion that outlaws vengeance, that puts forward turning your cheek and so on, vengeance is much easier to do in the ancient world. Christianity makes it much more difficult. So what you do as a result is you harbour resentments for people. You can't kill them outright, so you just resent them. Now, that's not a good thing either. But what Nietzsche tends to kind of mix up is historical causation there. I don't know whether I've explained that particularly well. But I'll give you one sense of what I'm talking about. In the ancient world, the Romans never stood around saying, well, this neighbouring community, they were mean to us and we're their victims, therefore we will kind of exact justice. They just said, look, we're stronger than you and we're going to destroy you. It's what the Greeks did as well. Modern cultures find that very difficult to say. Even the most tyrannical behaviours always justify themselves on the basis of standing up for victims. And that's a very perverse legacy of biblical revelation, which is very sensitive to the role of the victim in human culture. So in this sense, Christianity changed the world, changed our attitude towards violence. And the most atheistical denunciators of Christianity invariably invoke Christian values and are invariably the inheritors of a Christian outlook that is now in denial, that doesn't understand its own moral sources. It doesn't understand where its own editorial perspective comes from.
I haven't read Rene Girard. I have 2 or 3 friends on Facebook that are very excited about his ideas. But I recently did a post-mortem. I think you may have started listening to it in preparation for this interview. But in that post-mortem, I actually talk about the manliness of the Roman soldiers who nailed Jesus Christ to the cross. And I contrasted that manliness with the cowardice of Judas. Judas, who snuck off and made backroom deals with the Sanhedrin and so on and so forth. And so this was just a meditation where I was improvising just based on my intuition, but it sounds like it's resonating not only with Nietzsche, but also with Rene Girard, who has sort of a truth of Nietzsche and puts it into a Catholic context. Is that right?
Yeah, he does, and he obviously repudiates the morality behind Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche wants to bring back. People don't want to admit this about Nietzsche, but if you read The Will to Power, it becomes very clear. He wants to bring human sacrifice back. I mean, he really wants to bring some of these ancient practices back because he says without them, culture degenerates.
What would Nietzsche say about the abortion holocaust? What would his analysis be?
Well, I don't think he'd have any problem with abortion at all, but he would probably have problems with the quietness with which it's done. He would want it kind of openly celebrated. Look, I'm guessing at this, and I've got some friends who are Nietzsche scholars who would be kind of yelling at me at this point. But anyway, there's one train of his thought that is compatible with that.
Okay. You were going to say something about Rene Girard. I cut you off.
Oh, what was I going to say about him? I guess he's been perhaps the major intellectual influence in my life, and I was lucky to know him. And I went to Stanford in 2004, and I continued a dialogue with him over the years, and I was lucky to kind of count him as a friend. So he was a truly a gentle and lovely human being, and it was a wonderful experience.
Do you have any evidence to suggest that he might have been a dissident Catholic, or was he faithful to the magisterium and striving to obey?
You know, he gave out communion at Stanford. Like, he was a very orthodox Catholic in some ways. Now, I guess if you're going to think of him as a dissident in any way, it was that his notion of the atonement was a non-substitutionary atonement. Now, he argued that the substitutionary atonement, as it's traditionally formulated, was much more of a Protestant issue. And he said, go through the catechism, you're not going to find it in there. But there is a propitiatory notion of the atonement, which is that God's honour was so offended that humanity cannot take God's vengeance upon itself, so God requires a sacrifice, and therefore puts his son forward to take his own wrath and punishment. And Girard thought that was the most obscene and non-Christian version of the atonement, and he rejected that notion.
What did he replace it with?
Humans are the violent ones. Humans are the ones that gang up on each other and demand blood. God takes the punishment, which is not divine, it's human punishment, and takes that upon his own body, and thereby shows us that this is completely unnecessary and blows apart that system in so doing. And so what we normally read as the wrath of God is in fact the wrath of humanity. The God of love is not going to. I mean, there's a whole lot of kind of economic absurdities too with the other. How do you pay off a debt to yourself? I'd love to work that out, because then my credit card would be good. But, there's even a kind of economic absurdity to the traditional way. Now I'm simplifying the Anselmian account, right? And as he got older, Girard, initially he wanted to reject the idea of sacrifice altogether from Christianity. But as he gets older, in dialogue with the Jesuit, the Austrian-German Jesuit Raymond Schwager, who was a Karl Rahner chair at Innsbruck, he relaxed about this, and they have a 30-year dialogue about things like the atonement and Catholic theology, which I translated with Sheila Treflay-Hidden, came out a couple of years ago. There's this exchange of letters between the two of them about these things. But look, and I'm not a theologian, so I realise when I start talking about things like the atonement, I very quickly come up against the vast chasms of my ignorance. But yeah, that if you were to characterise him as having a view that was some distance from some Catholics' view of the atonement, then that would be it. Apart from that, it's very difficult to see him as anything but a very traditional Catholic man.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe your master's thesis, your PhD work? What were some of the projects that you worked on?
Sure, I've been all over the place. I mean, really what my PhD was about has nothing to do with this. It's in epistemology, so the theory of knowledge. And I was interested in the difference between certain kinds of conceptions of knowledge and the extent to which knowledge always takes place in a historical moment. It's always performed in particular ways. It's always performed, that is always done.
Who are some of the big names that you were building on that shared your point of view?
Paul Feyerabend would be one, Imre Lakatos, these philosophers of science, Stephen Schaffer, kind of sociologists of knowledge and historians of science, Bruno Latour, a French sociologist and philosopher. There's a bunch of them.
Are they all sort of continental postmodern types, or?
No, that's not a distinction I maybe respect as much as I should. most of the things that I end up doing are related to a question rather than related to a particular disciplinary perspective. So I tend to come up with questions and then figure out what sort of material is going to serve the answering of that, rather than starting within a disciplinary formation and letting that formation determine the kinds of questions I'm going to ask. I mean, it's an ambitious kind of idea, but it's very, I mean, I sort of think that we're here to answer questions, and the question's going to determine in some ways where you look for the answers to that. It means that I, again, reach the limits of my knowledge very, very quickly. As long as people let me get away with saying what I say, I'll keep writing.
So I asked you about a conversion moment in your religious journey, but in your own personal academic work, have there been moments where you're like, wow, I actually understand what I'm talking about in this one tiny particular aspect of my paper or my work? Are there moments like that where you get a clarity and you feel self-assured and confident that you've understood at least part of something?
Look, yeah, I think so. But what happens is that it happens retroactively. Like, I come back to revisit things that I may have looked at 10 years before, and suddenly I realize that I can understand a lot now that I didn't used to be able to understand. There's one book in particular I remember trying to read at the start of my doctorate, and I'm turning to a friend and just saying, I've got no idea what this person's talking about, like not a clue. I returned to it a few months ago just out of interest and it seemed absolutely clear. Now, that's a really nice thing in some ways, but it also makes me terrified, the extent to which my own forms of communication alienate people. But I mean, there are those kind of moments when I look back and think, oh, okay, my understanding of this stuff is better than it used to be.
You know, I have been accused of being overly cerebral or intellectual. Not that I'm smart or bright, but that I live in my head a little bit too much. Something you said early in this interview was interesting, is that we can't isolate, even though we'd like to, and we tend to isolate the intellectual component of a human being. We can't really do that. You've come to see that it's part and parcel of the whole person. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the role that reason plays in all that?
You know, so the cognitive behavioral therapy in psychology, among a whole series of things, it's built its whole career out of emphasizing the links between reason and the emotions. If I walk into a room and there's a snake on the bed, I freak out. But if I then realize through a series of cognitive operations that snake is in fact not a snake, but it's a belt, then I calm down. So the idea that there's this absolute dividing line is tricky. Now, having said that, I think the intellect can be used in a way that's defensive, as a way of avoiding certain emotional moments, that you rationalize things away, that you minimize the impact of things on you, and that you explain things away. Now, I think that can be a danger. I mean, usually when people say you're thinking too much, the problem isn't that I'm thinking too much. The problem is I'm thinking too repetitively. That's the intellect kind of grinding itself down into the ground. But I don't ultimately accept that there's any real genuine separation. I mean, there is some separation that we can talk about reason and emotion. They do name different sorts of things, but when you get right down to the depths of human experience, that distinction really does break down. The emotions in a sense are judgments, right? So if you, for instance, the experience of anger correlates most of the time against a felt sense of injustice. And so anger will rise up very often, now rightly or wrongly, in the face of what you assess to be an injustice. And now if you accept that, then emotions themselves are forms of reason. I mean, the obvious response to that is, yeah, but that's crazy because you can be wrong about all that stuff. You can be very angry over nothing. And the response to that is, who cares? We're wrong about our normal reason anyway. We make mathematical mistakes and we make misjudgments. And apparently someone in America recently was failed for saying Australia was a country. Yeah, one of their universities. So, but, like there is, I think they are, reason and emotion are deeply connected to each other, and there's nobody amongst us that runs along just one of these lines. But yeah, they're really connected.
I want to talk a little bit about the will, the human will, the free will, the reality of free will, what that implies philosophically for you, from your understanding, and how it interacts with reason.
I think the relationship between reason and will is there's no coherent argument for determinism at all. And I think Kant really shows this in the Critique of Pure Reason. A number of people have shown it in a number of different places. I mean, even C.S. Lewis demonstrates a version of this argument in a book, Miracles. But if you are to accept that determinism is true, then you have to admit that you were actually determined to come up with that answer, which is, of course, incompatible with reason, right? In order to come to a judgment, a rational judgment, there is a sense in which we have to be able to choose between alternatives. And the Catholic thinkers, Finis, Tolleson, and Grisez came up with a version of this argument that ultimately determinism is self-refuting, that any argument for determinism is going to undermine determinism. If the conclusions I come to intellectually are simply the result of brain firing, then there's no reason to trust them.
Every atheist that I talk with who's willing to debate with me on a friendly level, I do confront them with the laws of thought, and there are various ways of regrouping these laws of thought. But, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and what's the third popular one there?
The law of identity.
Yeah, the law of identity. So how rock solid is that foundation philosophically in your estimation? Is it emphasized in academia? Is it completely glossed over? Is it mocked and ridiculed as outdated?
Not really. It's not even very commonly covered, partly because they're so self-evident. I mean, these things are taught, but usually the way they're taught is through what we call informal plausible reasoning. So you teach kind of basic critical thinking skills, and all of those things are assumed. Now, I'm much more confident with non-contradiction and excluded middle than the law of identity. But I think they're about as rock solid as you can get, and you find people tripping themselves up. And any attempt to argue against those laws are going to end up affirming them at a certain point. It's like quicksand. Every attempt to deny them affirms them at a deeper level.
Now, have you ever considered yourself a hard agnostic, meaning that epistemologically you threw your hands up in the air? Or were you ever confident labeling yourself as some sort of skeptic? If you could talk a little bit, in terms of religion and or philosophy, about these notions of doubt and your expertise in epistemology and how agnosticism and skepticism sort of play, where do they fit into that world?
One of the ostensible selling points of agnosticism is its humility, right? You'll get someone saying, well, I can't believe or not believe, and there's this kind of implied nobility of the agnostic. And I have a bad reaction to that generally. Partly because agnosticism itself, depending on the form that it takes, has an incredibly ambitious view of human knowledge. So if you say, look, human beings cannot know X, Y, or Z, then you have an amazing confidence about the extent and limits of human reason. So there is a sense in which agnosticism does not appeal to me, in a sense, partly also because we live our beliefs anyway. Regardless of what your view, for instance, about morality is, you actually inhabit and you live your philosophy in a sense. It's not something you can withhold judgment about. Skepticism. I'm not sure whether skepticism can be upheld because, of course, if you're going to be skeptical, you need that's the universal acid, right? And that works against skepticism itself. You have to be skeptical about your skepticism. And the fact is that for all intents and purposes, our skepticism dissolves when faced with the realities of the world. You can be a skeptic, but you find if you're crossing the road, very quickly you're not. Is this truck really approaching me, isn't it? Like you find again, even at these limit points of human experience, skeptics drop their skepticism. My students are all very skeptical kind of relativists, but their basis for it is different. Their basis is they think that if they're not, then they're going to be intolerant, and intolerance is the worst thing in the world. I mean, that's another thing to talk about. But the reason that skepticism comes into the social domain a lot of the time is not an epistemological thing at all. It's an ethical and a political thing. And I think that's a mistaken view. But anyway, maybe we can get to that.
Yeah, there's this idea that's floating around sort of in the right, the political right, as a reaction to the left. And I'm not a big right-left proponent. I don't fall into one side or the other. I don't get into politics. But there are people that claim to be on the right and that talk about the left. And what they say is, and there seems to be some evidence for this, is that it's rooted in Marxism. It's a sort of cultural Marxism where the physical violence didn't work. So now we're going to just attack ideas. And it seems that the people on the left, whether they know it or not, they're serving a sort of cultural Marxism and undermining Christianity, undermining absolute objective truth and morality. And they don't even know that they're doing it. Can you just sort of talk from your perspective as a philosopher? What have you read? What have you seen in our culture with political correctness? What's your analysis?
I think that the left seems to have this idea that you can't oppress people, and the way you oppress people is almost by disagreeing with them. Let me put this another way. There is a certain conception that civil peace is based on agreement, that if anyone disagrees with you, so someone on the right will say X and someone on the left says basically you can't say that, with the idea that the way that we secure any sort of civic order is through agreement, and that you treat everything as equivalent in a way. Now, the left, of course, doesn't believe that because it has its own hierarchy of values, but there is that assumption. Now, the problem is that you end up treating beliefs as if they're children's paintings. Oh, that one's nice and I like that one, and that one's good. That one's good too. That's not really a way of paying respect to anything. To accord every single cognitive formation as somehow equivalent, which of course people don't do, but they pretend that they do anyway, is not a form of respect. I mean, I think science in some way provides a really good social model. You have a community based on rational and principled disagreement that doesn't fall apart because of that. So we've somehow falsely equated civic order with agreement, and that's a really dangerous thing to have done. Now, political correctness is a tricky one because generally when the term comes up, it means someone's attacking an idea. Nobody on the left goes, I'm going to be politically correct now, right? So it's used as a term of criticism. And it does actually name a phenomena and a stifling social phenomena. But what political correctness is this awareness of the extent to which we produce victims, and this, I suppose, sometimes uncritical reaction to that, which I don't think is a coherent reaction a lot of the time, but I think it comes from a good place. And this awareness, it's a post-Holocaust phenomenon. After the Holocaust, we have an acute sense that people should not be persecuted on the basis of their identity, racial, national, and so on. But we can, being humans, we can then exploit that moral insight to our own ends and make ourselves look virtuous and wonderful. I mean, this is a huge topic, and I realise I'm talking in quite abbreviated ways about it. But I think political correctness names a genuine danger in discourse. But I think its danger can be overestimated, and I think that the ethical sources for what produces that are sound, regardless of how perverse its manifestations are.
So what this brings to mind is Socrates. He's one of my heroes of philosophy. Can you talk a little bit about Socrates, Plato, maybe even Aristotle to a limited extent, just in terms of the enduring value of that way of doing philosophy, because that really is the heart and soul of what gets me excited all through the history of Western philosophy. That is really the trail that I'm going to follow and that I intuitively relate to. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective and the millennials, the young kids today, how do they respond? Have you seen people responding to Socrates and Plato?
Look, it's interesting. They respond really well. I teach a course that used to be called Ancient and Hellenistic Thought, and nobody did it. So I called it Philosophy and the Good Life, and suddenly enrollments went up. Socrates, you have this encapsulation of the notion of philosophy as a way of living, not simply a series of propositions, not a number of doctrines or a number of texts. Of course, he didn't write anything down. But you have this approach to philosophy as a form of spirituality, that is, this relentless and incredibly honest search for the truth. And this, of course, had him killed for doing this. Now, Plato, of course, formalizes all that stuff, and he's unusual because he's one of the only ancient philosophers for which we have almost everything, I think everything he ever wrote. And again, you have a beautiful stylist and some incredible dialogues that I think just keep worth being revisited. Aristotle, again, a student of Plato, but here you have perhaps some of the most well worked out versions of what it means to live a good life. Of course, the conception of virtue and virtue ethics comes really from Aristotle. And of course, his impact on the Catholic Church was absolutely enormous. Plato also through the Neoplatonists to Augustine, but Aristotle, of course, through Aquinas. Now, unfortunately, we've only got Aristotle's lecture notes. We don't actually have any of his kind of proper books. But in Aristotle, I think you have some of the most fleshed out and some of the most incredibly articulated versions of what it means to live a good life. What stands up today is still an amazing body of work. And it's, the cliche is Alfred North Whitehead once said that philosophy is really just a series of footnotes to Plato. This overstates it, right? But there's something in that. And there are, between these three thinkers, a real setting of the agenda of Western philosophy that's still very much in evidence today. And they're thinkers that are worth revisiting for a number of reasons. But yeah.
Is there anything juvenile or naive about Plato's epistemology? Do you, as a sort of quasi-expert on epistemology, look back on him and laugh to yourself at how naive he was, or no?
It's such an interesting thing, philosophy has a very anxious relationship to its own history, right? And in a way that literature doesn't. Nobody ever looks back and go, Shakespeare, he's so old and so pathetic, but philosophy has this incredibly anxious and fraught relationship with its own past. It's basically a series of, depending on who's teaching it. If you read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, it's like, it really can be summed up in a few sentences, which look at all these idiots until I came along. If you read philosophy as a history of errors, you're really not doing much service for yourself. Now, of course, looking back on certain kind of Platonic doctrines, and the most obvious one is his epistemology and his theory of the forms and so on. Now, there's a big discussion about what the theory of the forms is. There's a naive, I think, view that his view of the forms is that, apart from an actual sheep, there's a ghostly sheep living in a heavenly realm. There are a number of experts on Plato that suggest that he's not really talking about that at all. He's just talking about abstract objects. But, there's a lot about Plato we can't buy in the way that it was articulated. But he's worth engaging with because the options that he gives philosophically are in many senses still live options. But I try to, at least when I teach these things, I try to resist wheeling Plato out as some kind of pinata that we look at and then everybody has a stick that can give a whack, which is often the way philosophy is taught and does a huge disrespect to its own history and blinds you from the extent to which you can still learn, put yourself at the feet of these people and learn something.
What do you think about sort of on the other extreme, what I consider the other extreme, which is nominalism, and in particular William of Ockham? Can you talk a little bit about his impact on the sort of death of scholasticism and that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is a big one, I guess, is that, the classic source on this is John Milbank and Catherine Pickstock and He's not an easy read, but Milbank came out with he's a English philosopher and theologian, came out with a book in I think late 90s, early 2000s called Theology and Social Theory, which he laid at the feet Occam every heresy and disaster of the modern world.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
Yeah, sure. I mean, linguistically, we're nominalist in the sense that, the English is only a contingent way of naming things. That, you have a French vocabulary, you use a different word. I mean, there's a kind of trite nominalism, but I don't think that things have no essences. I mean, if that were true, then there's a whole series of things that would be impossible to do, like baking a cake, and because it wouldn't matter whether you threw in butter or bolts. Like I really, if you want to talk in terms of essences, and it's not normally a kind of word that I use much, is I think nominalism is a kind of almost scientifically disprovable hypothesis, even at the level of philosophy. J.P. Moreland's book Universals is a fantastic criticism of nominalism. Now, I'm not representing it very well. I'm not representing it in its strongest form there, right? I'm kind of doing exactly what I said you shouldn't do, which is just kind of give something a whack. But no, I'm not a nominalist in that sense.
Do you see a pendulum swinging this way, then that way, then this way, then that way, and there's a time and place for the discussion to go over here and then back over there? Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is the thing, is that most of our thinking resolves itself into binaries, and the awful, and this is a Hegelian point, I guess, is there's something true about both ends of the spectrum. And that debate is a way, in a sense of, I think a lot of the time, not resolving it, but trying to show you that there's some strength in an opposition. Now, there's a general opposition to binaries. Which I think is itself incoherent. I had a student saying to me, he said, I think binaries are a terrible thing. They're this Western invention. I said, so you're a non-binary thinker? He said, yeah. I said, so non-binary over binary then? Which is, of course, a binary, right? Like, binarism is a very greedy idol. I mean, even Jacques Derrida, in an interview actually accuses him at one point of being overly binary, which you won't normally hear Derrida being accused of. And they say, you say that things mean this or mean that. Couldn't there be differences of degree? And Derrida just says, are there differences of degree or no differences of degree? I think you can take most of our forms of thought as ways of moving between two poles, each of which have something to say. Now, having said that, there are binaries that you can actually deconstruct and say, politics is a good example. Are you left? Are you right? Well, one response is, I'm not sure the kind of post-revolutionary seeding of the French, of the Estates General, the post-revolutionary France is the ultimate guide for how we should still be thinking about politics, right? Maybe it's not the most productive set of oppositions that you have to think about the political world, but in another way, sure, that does name something. And these shifts between two poles, I think, without relativizing everything, is a way of saying, hey, there's something here we haven't considered. So the difference between dualism and monism, I think, is a really interesting one, because both of them have got something to say that I think is of import. And I'm not trying to be a peacemaker here and say, well, everybody's right, But it does name a dialectic of thought that we have to be sensitive to.
You bring to mind the topic of the East. If you could just talk very briefly about the East and the futility of reason and all that sort of thing that I find so repugnant.
Yeah. Well, you do get that. And there are, so for instance, there are traditions within Buddhist thought that try to carry on a state of debate until it is shown that rational debate is pointless, after which there is a delivery from rational thought into a kind of enlightenment which is non-linguistic. The way that's often characterized is relative versus absolute. So reason has its validity at the relative level, but ultimately in many cases just to show you that reason is pointless, after which there is an absolute which is outside of all oppositions, outside of all reason. Now, for me, the problem is I can't make sense of that, really, because the very proposition that there's a relative versus an absolute requires a rational assent. It requires that you believe and understand certain things. And so I can't really make those forms of thought intelligible to myself. And so what I'm talking about here is, the tradition I'm thinking of specifically is Mahayana Buddhism and texts like Nagarjuna's The Wisdom of the Middle Way and so on. Now, I find those forms of thought quite difficult. And there are some sophisticated parallels between West and Eastern thought. I think Masao Abe, a Japanese philosopher of the 20th century, in a book called Zen and Western Thought, Keiji Nishitani, in a book called Religion and Nothingness, what's called the Kyoto School. Now, there is a fruitful dialogue to be had there. But look, I find it very difficult at a certain point to even follow the argument. And if I do, then it ends up looking to me like it's self-refuting. But that may just be a limit of my own appreciation of these philosophies. One of the difficulties is that Eastern philosophy, the very terms of engagement are very different to Western philosophy. There's a lot of bridge work that needs to be done.
What comes to mind as you're speaking is one of my favorite quotes from Nietzsche, which I find true and very powerful, is that we will not have killed God until we have also killed grammar. If we want to abandon the Western way, we're reduced to sort of sitting in the corner and maybe grunting incoherently. That's about it. Basically, we cannot engage with grammar or with any sort of rational communication. So was Nietzsche, I know he's a very colorful character and he brings a lot to the table that's not necessarily coherent, but was he influenced by the East? Was he dabbling in Eastern ideas?
Yeah, he was. But again, he engages with it in his very own specific kind of way, and for him it was an assess. He thought Buddhism was like a bad Christianity. Buddha was weak, just like Jesus. There's these funny, if you want a religion for man, you kind of go to Islam. But, so he did have some engagement with Eastern thought. Graham Parks is a guy who's edited a book called Nietzsche and Asian Thought. But again, Nietzsche was not he was definitely not a scholar of Eastern thought. He did not have for a start, you're dealing with an expertise in languages that only now is sort of becoming available. Having said that, I think what he's saying can be, you can take it in a very specific way. Put it this way. If human beings are simply a kind of the product of random processes of natural selection, then our cognitive capacities have not developed to tell us the truth. They've developed in order to have us survive. That may involve the truth. It may not. There's a lot of ways we could talk about this. For instance, someone might say to me, but we have evolved to kind of be able to tell the truth. If you see the car raging up the road, if you can see it and jump out of the way, then you're going to have an evolutionary advantage. It's not necessarily true. You could see that as a ghost. You could see it as a storm coming at you. You could just see it as a superstition. So in a sense, just a kind of purely naturalistic account of evolution is going to give us absolutely no guarantee that our thought, that our forms of language in any way connects to reality. What it is going to ensure simply is that it's our survival. But once you admit that, then evolutionary naturalism itself, we don't even know whether that's true anymore. So there is his point's kind of well taken, and it was developed, that thought about grammar and God has been subject of a lot of reflection, some of it good, some of it not so good in continental philosophy. But yeah, there's something to be said for
it. One sort of idea that's floating around in my mind as we've talked today about the sort of history of Western philosophy is, well, I could draw a parallel with fashion. The 80s had a specific fashion, the 70s had a fashion, the 60s definitely had a fashion, the 40s, the 30s, the 20s. We can see these trends in fashion. But we don't really see the fashion of the day. I'm wondering if the genius philosophers see the whole history of the fashion of philosophy, the ideas that are being thrown around. Do the geniuses of philosophy see that, and are they aware of that, and are they working with that, or is it only in hindsight? Do we always build on a few generations before, or a few decades or centuries before? Are we limited to looking back a certain fixed distance before we can see clearly?
That's such a difficult question. In some way, the geniuses of philosophy, in some way we see them because they see past fashion. In some ways we see them like that because they are the most fashionable. And I didn't see this at the time when I was doing my doctorate. There was all these names floating about and problems. And 20 years later, you kind of look at it and I think, oh, they're all uncool now. I mean, not that they're wrong. They're just uncool, right? They're just, and these things come back. I remember when I first started my doctorate, nobody wanted to mention Jean-Paul Sartre, like he was just a human and he was the worst of the worst. The last conference I went to was a whole session dedicated to his work. Now, does that mean suddenly we've suddenly seen that what he said was really coherent and really, good in a way that we didn't appreciate? No, this is the thing, is that cool and fashion permeates academia just as much as it permeates any other area of culture. One of the advantages of fashion is that it creates a common discourse. If everyone is converging around a particular problem or theorist, then we're talking to each other and we can try to figure stuff out. And that is one of the advantages to it. But whether thinkers see through fashions and where they don't, I think anyone who has a good sense of intellectual history realizes just how little novelty there is in thought, that the same issues, the same problems. I mean, I was looking at, one of the ancient skeptics, Sextus Empiricus, recently, and it was stunning. Some of the things that he said looked like they could have been written, one in the mid-90s, one in the early 2000s. And so any broader sense of history relativizes the newness of what we're doing. But yeah, it's very hard to step out of our own historical moment.
Well, what you just said brings to mind the fool in the marketplace with his lantern or whatever. He was sort of ahead of his time, right? Is that what Nietzsche was trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things he's trying to say, but one of them is that there's a kind of casual, middle-class atheism that doesn't understand itself, which is the idea that you can give up God and everything remains the same. But Nietzsche says if you actually see what you've done, you understand that things really have to change. That as an atheist, things don't look the same as what they used to. And what he saw was a kind of cultural Christianity that was absurd given the presuppositions that it's rejected. I mean, you see this in my students all the time. I remember coming to the end of a particular unit and I was trying to get people to sum up their own ethic. And one guy, I thought it encapsulated the whole generation. He said, oh, look, my ethic is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But, not in a Christian sense. And it's like, wow. I mean, the Nietzsche in the marketplace is there then. But yeah, it is. There's a few senses of that. But the sense of the person being ahead of his time is that he sees that people have rejected something, but they don't understand the implications of that rejection.
Are you familiar with this term that I've heard kicked around, cognitive dissonance? What is that exactly, psychologically and philosophically?
I'm not a psychologist, but it's my understanding of the term is that in a state of cognitive dissonance, something is proved to be incorrect, but what would normally undermine the belief doesn't undermine the belief. So you have a doomsday cult, for instance, and they put a particular day as the end of the world, and that day comes and goes, and yet the cult remains integrated and stronger than ever. And that, I think it was in those kind of contexts that cognitive dissonance was first used as a way of talking about the fact that a belief that should be undermined by evidence is in fact strengthened by it.
Another notion that sort of comes to mind during our talk here is, I forget who said it. It was a Catholic, maybe a saint, who said, that if we don't live according to how we believe, then soon we begin to believe according to how we live. When we don't face our philosophy, then we get a default philosophy, because you did mention this earlier in our talk. I just want you to flesh that out a little bit for me, the sort of dangers implied in that.
Yeah, look, I think the thing is that philosophy is not something that you do or you don't do. You either do it consciously and coherently, or you do it unconsciously and incoherently. The fact is that philosophy's only got a few questions, really. What's real? What can we know? And what's good and what's evil? That's about it. I mean, people in my discipline don't like to put it so boldly because it sounds too simplistic, but that's it, really. I mean, there are versions of that. So philosophy of science grows out of the knowledge question. I mean, political theory grows out of the good and evil question and so on, but they're really the questions that philosophy asks. Now, the fact is that all of us have conceptions of what those things are. I was speaking to an engineer once, and he just told me that the only things that's real are, measurable, right? That was his statement to me.
Logical positivism.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And
the only philosophy that's been proven false.
Well, exactly, right? Like, he kind of said, well, unless it's kind of done by a scientific experiment, it's not worth believing. And of course, the question you then ask him is, when was that proved? There's no experiment that proves that particular point. But again, it's one of these amazing self-exploding philosophies. But so, there is a sense in everyone is a philosopher, in the sense that not everyone, is a veterinary surgeon or a medieval historian. Everyone is, in fact, a philosopher. So, there is, so we're all philosophers to an extent, but that's I'm really interested in that other idea, that in fact you end up kind of believing the way you behave. That's a really interesting one, because normally we think the equation works the other way around. But that is, and I don't even know whether I've got much to say about it, but I'm going to now really think about it, is that our behaviour ends up producing our beliefs in some ways. Yeah, it's a really interesting thought, actually. I'm trying to see how that comports, in fact, with some of the things I said about what I did in my doctorate, but I'd have to think more about it.
Well, I'll definitely have you back for part 2 if you're willing at some point.
Sure, I'd love to.
I am going to let you go, but when I wrap up my interviews, I always give my guests the last word. And you did mention earlier that in your early 20s, or at some point in your early adult life, you had a bout of depression and some darkness. There are, whether you like it or not, there are a lot of people out there on the internet that are just isolated by technology. They're lonely, they're depressed, some of them are suicidal. So I always like to give a little message of hope, not from myself, but from my guest. What have you lived? What have you experienced? What have you learned? What wisdom do you have to share in a very general and pleasant way? So just to wrap up the show, what might you say to someone that might be out there listening now?
Well, with respect to depression and low moods, one of the things that you can end up thinking is that, I'm never going to feel good again. My life is never going to be right again. That basically what I'm facing is the darkness of today played out into all eternity. I guess the thing to realise is that's a symptom. Hope is not an unfounded thing. I don't think it's a form of optimism. I think it really is a form of realism. There is a way of living on and living through these things, and part of it just requires persistence and some faith that things can turn right, and the fact is that they do.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is